For organizations and project teams that are managing global digital transformations, it's a lot like the game of Risk. I'm going to talk today about what you need to know about your global transformation before you get started. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting Group. We're an independent and technology agnostic consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformations. And a good subset of our client base are global organizations, companies that operate in multiple countries, they sell in multiple countries. A lot of time they've grown organically, other times they've grown through acquisition. But whatever the case, a lot of them are multinational with disparate operations and somewhat siloed operations throughout the world. And they're looking for ERP or HCM technology to help consolidate and bring everything together under one umbrella that's more consistent. So in today's video, I want to talk about what the things are that we need to be aware of and how we want to manage it, much like a game of Risk. Now, Risk is a game about global domination. It's about war. It's about winning and defeat and that sort of thing. And even though it might be a little dramatic for a digital transformation, it can be helpful to think about your transformation as a game of Risk. And how are we going to manage our change? And how are we going to manage the ground troops to get these changes deployed throughout our entire global organization? Now, the first thing we want to do in managing our global transformation is to figure out what is our future state operating model for the entire globe. So look at how many operations you have and look at how differently those different operations work. And what we want to do here is figure out what is it we want to be when we grow up. We may have, let's say, 5 or 7 different global locations, and we probably have 5 or 7 different ways of operating. So we need to figure out what is that going to look like going forward. Now, the first step within that is to figure out, do we want to standardize all those locations? Do we want to retain a certain amount of flexibility and decentralization? Or is it going to be what most companies decide, which is it's going to be a hybrid, a mix of both? We might have certain functions that are going to be more centralized and standardized, more of a shared services model, like your finance, your HR, your IT, your accounting. Those are common areas where we say those are areas where we are going to consolidate and standardize and look for a global operating model. Other organizations will often decide that part or all of their operations are going to remain decentralized or more flexible. So it may be that we're going to roll out global technology, but we're going to let those different global locations on the map here operate independently and continue to do what they need to do to be close to their customers and service the customers that may be different across different locations. And so that's part of what we need to look at is it an all or nothing proposition? Are we somewhere in the middle, some kind of a hybrid approach where we want to have part of our operations retain their flexibility and other parts more standardized? Those are the types of questions we need to answer. And we need to have clear alignment on those answers before we get started. What we see happen often is a lot of companies start rolling technology out across the map here, but they haven't figured out what's the map going to look like. How are these different locations going to operate? What are the big decisions we need to make as an organization? And so in other words, this is much more than a technology initiative. This is a business transformation and this is a business initiative. So we need to figure out, what does the business look like? What do we want that future state operating model to look like across our different locations? So once we have alignment on that, then it's a lot easier to be effective and to move forward to the next step in the process. So once we've defined what we want our future state operating model to look like, now we need to figure out, how are we going to roll that out? Are we going to do somewhat of a big bang approach, which, by the way, I rarely recommend that to clients, especially global organizations? Or are we going to do some sort of phased rollout? And if we do a phased rollout, how are we going to phase it? What are the things we're going to do first? Who's going to go live when? And how are we going to go about this whole process? So there's a few things to think about as we're trying to define what that rollout strategy is going to look like. First is we want to look at operational risk. Where are the places or the parts of the organization that we could realistically have a first go live without exposing the organization to too much risk, without shutting down potentially operations across too much of the organization. The other thing we have to think about is, as we go incrementally, how much risk are we willing to take on? Do we want to take on bigger changes all at once, or do we want to do more of an incremental approach? The speed at which we go through the transformation is extremely important. And that's something that's important for you to decide as a business and to do so in an agnostic way, because what often happens is the software vendors, the system integrators will push you very hard to go quickly. And typically they'll push you to go faster than most organizations are comfortable going. So what you need to figure out is how comfortable are we taking on risk, and what are some of the challenges we expect along the way, and how are we going to manage those risks, and what's a more measured incremental pace for us to go. So that's the next step, is to figure out what sequence do we want these different organizations or parts of the organization to go live on the new technology with the new process changes and the new operating model and all the stuff we've talked about so far. Now, another part of having that rollout strategy defined is to make sure we have a resource strategy too. Do we have the right levels of resource to support all the different phases of the project, for all the different support that we're going to need throughout the deployment? And that goes for not only your internal resources, your internal IT resources, your internal business stakeholders, your business users, and also your external consultants. Just make sure you have a realistic and reasonable resource plan to ensure that you have a way to execute that desired plan and strategy. Now, the next step is arguably the most important step in the whole process, which is to define your organizational change strategy for your global transformation. And this is where the board game and the game of risk really comes in handy as an analogy here. We think about all the changes that we're rolling out across the globe and all the different cultures we're dealing with, people with past histories, and a lot of times we've acquired these organizations and they have their own way of operating, and now we're coming in as a team and saying we're going to change the way you've operated for however long. So from a change management perspective, global change is extremely difficult, and it's completely underrated. Most vendors and system integrators downplay the risk, but this is the biggest risk that global organizations face, is on the organizational change side. And it's helpful to think of it as somewhat of a ground war. We're trying to win the minds and hearts of people to embrace and accept the changes that are going to be coming their way. We want them to understand the changes. We want them to be a part of the change. We want their roles and responsibilities to be clearly defined, and it happens step by step, incrementally. It's not something that happens overnight. Much like games of risk, I've played hours-long marathons with my son, and this game can take forever. And much like this game, going through the changes you're about to go through can take forever as well. So we want to make sure we have a clear understanding of what is the change going to entail. And as we look at each individual country and location that we operate in, we're going to have completely different issues and risks and organizational change issues that we need to manage. So we need to understand the lay of the land and all the different locations that we're going to be implementing to. And we need to understand how they operate today so that we can understand how we can get them to the way they need to operate in the future. And by the way, part of defining this organizational change plan and this whole ground game for how we manage the change can also be an important input into the earlier step we talked about, which was what is our rollout strategy and how do we phase the project. Oftentimes you'll find some fairly significant landmines in organizational risks, as we do an organizational assessment for a global company, that will influence how we ultimately roll out the technology. So those are some of the things we need to think about. I've included links below, by the way, to more detail on how to define an organizational change strategy. But for the purposes of today's video, just know that this is probably the most important step that you'll go through as a global team and as a global transformation. So as we move through the game of risk, if you will, and we go through our transformation and we convert country by country the locations onto the new operating model, onto the new technologies, onto the new organizational design, as you start to take over more of the board in those global transformations, we now need to figure out how do we support those local organizations. We're not just going to flip the switch and go live and hope for the best and just parachute in, and if there's a major problem, like we can't ship product, we need to make sure we've got boots on the ground there ready to roll on day one of go live, because that's the day, and the days after that are important too, that you're likely to have the most challenge and the most frustration. And that's oftentimes the moment of truth of when we determine whether or not this project is successful or not. So while we want to make sure we have a solid plan and we've executed everything very well up until this point, we still don't want to mess it up at the last minute by not having a solid go-live support model. And we see a lot of organizations spread themselves too thin when they're going through that type of deployment. And again, like the game of risk, if you've played this game before and you have too few armies spread across too many countries, you're going to lose the game. So it's all about consolidating power and influence and building out from there. And that's much like what we need to do in a digital transformation, is we don't want to spread ourselves too thin as we take over a country. And I hate to say take over in the war analogy, but just to stick with me here, as we go live and take over new locations of our global organization, we need to make sure we have reinforcement and support there to help deal with the organizational and operational issues that oftentimes happen at the time of go live. That will enable us to make sure that we're mitigating risk and that we ultimately have a successful project. So I hope this helps. This is what you need to know for your global transformation. In addition to what I've shared in this video, I've also included some links below that give you some important information to help you guide you in your transformation, including our 2020 ERP report, which provides some good best practices on how to make your ERP project more successful. I've also included some links to some other videos that might help you as well as they related to global transformations. If you like this video, please like it. If you've experienced your own global transformation types of issues, I ask you to please comment below. I'd love to hear what kind of feedback you have and what issues you've experienced or maybe you are experiencing right now in your transformation. Thanks very much for your time and hope to chat with you soon.